Have you ever wondered what a nation remembers when the fighting stops? Behind every war, there are voices that were never heard, roads that were never walked again, and hearts that still carry the weight of silence. Today, we're going to walk gently through the story of the China War, not just with facts, but with the feelings that history often forgets. China's history is filled with a series of conflicts that span centuries, but in the modern era, the number and intensity of wars have shaped its identity in powerful ways. From invasions by foreign powers to internal struggles over ideology, China has experienced nearly every form of warfare. The Qing dynasty, which ruled for over 2 centuries, saw its power weaken under the pressure of Western imperialism and internal rebellions. The Opium Wars with Britain in the 19th century were among the earliest examples of modern military conflict involving China and foreign nations. These wars were not just about drugs or trade, they represented the clash between two very different worldviews and power dynamics. After the fall of the Qing Empire, the early 20th century saw China fragment into regions controlled by warlords. During this period of instability, the country was vulnerable to foreign invasion and internal strife. As Japan expanded its empire, China was one of the nations most directly affected, leading to the devastating Second Sino-Japanese War. After Japan was defeated, China's internal battle between the communists and the nationalists escalated into a full civil war, each side dreaming of a different future for the country. Once the People's Republic of China was established in 1949, new conflicts emerged, not only at the borders, such as with India in 1962, but also with ideological rivals like Vietnam. These wars, whether fought in mountainous terrain or political halls, all played a role in shaping modern China's sense of national pride, territorial integrity, and sovereignty. Every war China engaged in brought loss, resistance, and change. It also brought deeper questions about identity, unity, and what kind of nation China was becoming. Understanding these wars means understanding the journey of a people constantly tested, yet always moving forward. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in 1937 and became one of the most painful chapters in China's modern history. Tensions between China and Japan had been rising for years, but the conflict escalated after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, which marked the beginning of full-scale war. Japan, with a far more advanced military at the time, launched brutal attacks on Chinese cities, targeting not only soldiers, but also civilians. One of the darkest moments was the Nanjing Massacre, where Japanese forces killed hundreds of thousands of people in the Chinese capital and committed widespread atrocities. Cities like Shanghai, Wuhan, and Chongqing became battlegrounds, and the Chinese people had to flee, hide, or resist in whatever way they could. Despite being poorly equipped, Chinese forces, both nationalists and communists, put up strong resistance. The war forced an uneasy alliance between the two rival factions within China, temporarily putting aside their civil conflict to fight a common enemy. While the Chinese government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, retreated inland, the population suffered from bombings, starvation, and disease. In rural areas, guerrilla fighters sabotaged Japanese supply lines and built secret support networks. The international world began to take notice of China's suffering, and support began to trickle in, though often not fast enough. The war lasted until 1945, when Japan surrendered following the atomic bombings by the United States and the end of World War II. By then, China had lost millions of lives, and its cities and countryside lay in ruin. The deep scars left by this war would remain for generations. Yet, within that time of darkness, the resilience of the Chinese people shone through. Their spirit of endurance and unity under extreme hardship became a symbol of national identity and pride in the years that followed. The Chinese Civil War was a prolonged and deeply transformative conflict that began in 1927 and lasted, in different phases, until 1949. It was fought between two major political forces, the nationalists, known as the Kuomintang KMT, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese Communist Party CCP, led by Mao Zedong. After the fall of the Qing dynasty, China faced fragmentation and instability, and both groups emerged with different visions for the country's future. The nationalists aimed to build a strong, centralized government rooted in traditional and republican values, while the communists sought to establish a socialist state led by the working class and peasants. Initially, both sides cooperated under the First United Front to fight warlords and unify China. But growing ideological differences and political mistrust led to open conflict. In 1927, the nationalists turned against the communists, sparking a brutal struggle that would last for over 2 decades. The war was interrupted by the Second Sino-Japanese War from 1937 to 1945, during which both factions formed a temporary alliance to resist the Japanese invasion. However, after Japan's defeat, the Civil War resumed with even greater intensity. The communists gained strong support from the rural population, who were drawn to their promises of land reform and equality. They used guerrilla tactics effectively and gradually built strength, especially in the countryside. By contrast, the nationalists were weakened by corruption, inflation, and lack of support from war-weary citizens. After a series of decisive battles, including the Liaoshan Weihai and Pingjin campaigns, the communist forces emerged victorious. In 1949, Mao Zedong declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. While the nationalists retreated to Taiwan, the end of the war marked the beginning of communist rule in mainland China and set the stage for decades of political and social transformation. The Sino-Indian War of 1962 was a brief but intense conflict between China and India, triggered by a long-standing border dispute in the Himalayan region. The origins of the conflict go back to differing perceptions of national borders. India inherited the British-drawn McMahon Line as its northeastern boundary, while China did not recognize it, claiming the area as part of its territory. In the western sector, China controlled Aksai Chin, a region India considered its own. Tensions rose when both countries began building roads and military outposts in disputed areas, leading to increased encounters between their forces. Diplomatic talks failed to resolve the issue, and by October 1962, Chinese troops launched a surprise offensive along both the eastern and western fronts. The Indian Army, poorly equipped and unprepared for high-altitude combat, struggled to hold its ground. In contrast, Chinese forces, having trained extensively in mountainous terrain and having superior logistics, advanced rapidly and overwhelmed Indian defenses. The fighting lasted for about a month, during which Chinese troops captured significant territory, especially in the eastern sector of Arunachal Pradesh and the western area of Ladakh. Despite their military advantage, China declared a unilateral ceasefire on November 21, 1962, and withdrew from the eastern sector but retained control over Aksai Chin in the west. The war shocked India and led to a complete reassessment of its defense and foreign policies. It also severely damaged relations between the two countries, creating a legacy of mistrust that persists to this day. For China, the conflict was seen as a demonstration of its strength and resolve to defend what it considered its sovereign territory. The war also influenced regional dynamics in Asia, drawing global attention during the Cold War era and impacting alliances and strategic planning across neighboring nations. The Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 was a short but fierce conflict that occurred when China launched a military invasion of northern Vietnam. The roots of the war lay in the complicated relationship between the two communist neighbors. Although both countries were ideologically aligned, tensions had been growing over border disputes, regional influence, and Vietnam's increasing closeness with the Soviet Union, which China saw as a rival. The immediate cause of the war was Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia in 1978, which resulted in the overthrow of the Khmer Rouge regime that China supported. In response, China decided to teach Vietnam a lesson by launching a large-scale offensive across their shared border. On February 17, 1979, Chinese troops crossed into Vietnam and targeted several northern provinces, including Lang, Sen, Cao Baning, and Lo Che. The fighting was brutal, involving tens of thousands of troops on both sides. The Chinese military faced stiff resistance from seasoned Vietnamese forces who had just come out of a long war against the United States. Despite making some gains, Chinese troops suffered heavy casualties and logistical challenges due to difficult terrain and fierce guerrilla-style defense by the Vietnamese. After about 3 weeks of intense fighting, China declared that its mission was complete and began withdrawing its forces. Although the war was short, it left deep scars on both nations. Vietnam suffered infrastructure damage and civilian losses in the north, while China faced criticism for the cost and lack of clear victory. The war did not change any territorial boundaries, but exposed the fragile relationships within the communist world. In the years following the conflict, tensions remained high, with frequent skirmishes and military buildup along the border. The war demonstrated how political rivalry, even among ideological allies, could erupt into open confrontation with lasting consequences. Even after the battle's end and soldiers return home, the effects of war do not disappear. In China's case, the aftermath of each conflict left behind more than just damaged cities or changed borders. It left emotional scars on generations, reshaped political decisions, and influenced how the country saw itself and the world. Families who lost loved ones carried that pain for the rest of their lives. Veterans who returned often had no words for what they saw or did. In towns that were bombed or invaded, the memories stayed alive in silence, in stories passed down, or in the eyes of the elderly who still remembered the sound of fear. On a larger scale, these wars pushed China to rebuild itself again and again. After the Civil War, the new government tried to create a society where the past wouldn't repeat itself, but this came with strict control, hard decisions, and a desire to remain strong and united at all costs. In border areas where wars were fought, roads were built, soldiers remained, and people grew up next to watchtowers instead of playgrounds. The memory of loss became part of the national identity, something that schools, museums, and history books reminded people of. It also changed how China behaved globally, choosing to be cautious, assertive, or sometimes defensive in its foreign policy. In places like Aksai Chin, Nanjing, and Lang Sen, the land itself still holds the weight of history. Children play in fields where battles once raged, not always knowing what came before. But their grandparents remember. The story of China's wars is not just about fighting, it's about how a nation carries its past into the present, and how people learn to live again after the silence of the gunfire fades away. War leaves behind more than broken buildings, and battlefields it leaves behind stories, memories, and lessons that shape who we become. In the story of China's wars, we see pain, division, courage, and the deep longing for peace. From foreign invasions to civil struggles, from frozen borders to silent sacrifices, each chapter shows how a nation rises not only through strength, but through healing. These stories remind us that even in the darkest times, people still hold on to hope, still rebuild, and still teach the next generation the value of understanding over conflict. The past cannot be changed, but what we do with its lessons will shape the future for China and for us all.